So we might get started. We'll just do the introductions and people can continue to join. So thank you all for joining us and welcome. Integrity was such a major issue for a lot of people at the most recent election. And so there's been some developments and we thought it would be a good time to update everyone. So thank you so much for coming. I'll start by just acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, or that I'm coming from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their care of this country, this coastline and these waterways since time immemorial. May we learn from their experience. But I'd like to say an enormous thank you to both our very special guests for joining us tonight. We are indeed very lucky to have these guests. Dr. Helen Haines, who is a fellow MP of mine on the crossbench, the independent member for Indi, and Anthony Whealy, KC is it now, who was a former judge for New South Wales Court of Appeal and a commissioner for the New South Wales Integrity Commission, and currently the chair of the Centre for Public Integrity. And I should say that Dr. Helen Haines was the recipient of the 2022 Misson Award for work on integrity in politics. So congratulations, Helen, and thank you so much to both of you. I should say that it's wonderful to have Helen here tonight, and Anthony. Helen is a role model for me, has been a role model for me on the crossbench. As we've seen for the past few years, she's approached politics with enormous poise and dignity and a great deal of respect. And both our guests tonight are absolutely at the heart and soul of this drive for greater integrity in our political system, and starting with the National Anti-Corruption Committee. So thank you to you both. What I would say is both Anthony and Helen are, as I said, are at the core of what has happened with integrity. Helen has absolutely led out front. People ask, what is the power of an independent? And the power of an independent is absolutely informing debate and keeping issues in the media spotlight, which is absolutely what Helen did. And also Anthony as well. Every time there was an issue about integrity in the media, there was Anthony speaking in his very logical and simple way and very persuasive way. So I thank you both for everything that you've done for this country in terms of driving the integrity agenda. I would say tonight I'm going to ask Helen and Anthony a few questions, and then we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to put your questions in the Q&A, there's two functions. There's the chat function and there's also the Q&A function, which allows people to be anonymous, but we will have a look at the chat function as well, and we'll get onto those questions after we've had a bit of a chat and got started. So as we know, the National Anti-Corruption Commission was introduced by the Attorney General last month, and we've been waiting for this for a very long while. And while the Attorney General we're very grateful for, was very collaborative and did consult with the crossbench and did invite recommendations and actually accepted a few, there were a few surprises when the Anti-Corruption Commission was introduced. So I would love to hear from both of you, maybe starting with Helen tonight, just on what you feel are the positives of this model of the Anti-Corruption Commission. What does it do well? What is missing? What elements are missing? And perhaps how can we go further with this?
Well, thank you very much, Sophie, and good evening to you, Anthony, and good evening to the many people who are on this webinar. It's wonderful. Congratulations to all of you for being so interested in what is probably the greatest integrity reform that our nation has seen in many decades. And Sophie, you were very generous in your introduction. I'd just like to point out that Anthony has been at this way, way longer than I have, and certainly
I'm a lot older.
Well, I am but one small brick in a very substantial wall that's been constructed on this issue. And it's an issue that's really important because it matters to everyday people. It matters because we've seen, as you all know, we've seen trust in our governments slip down the league tables globally. And we've seen people so frustrated and becoming cynical around governments operating in a way that doesn't appear to be always in the public interest. And ultimately, for us as parliamentarians, Sophie, and for public officials more broadly, it's absolutely contingent upon us to always act in the public interest. So this reform has been long called for, and I've played some small part in that, and indeed introduced legislation to the Parliament twice, actually, in the last Parliament. And so grateful to Anthony and his colleagues for the help, enormous advice and help they've given me on that. So this bill, I celebrate it. It is the first time any government has introduced legislation into the House to establish an anti-corruption body. I would prefer it was an integrity commission, and I've said that for a long time. I think we should always go for pro-integrity rather than anti-corruption, but nevertheless, it is a powerful and independent body. This is largely a very good piece of legislation. It adheres to the 7 principles that the Attorney General put out to us earlier in the year. It adheres to the principles that I'd established in the Australian Federal Integrity Commission bill that I put forward. So things like the capacity to have public hearing when in the public interest to do so, one set of rules for everyone, the capacity to have retrospectivity to look back in time. It appears to have pretty good funding. That could be moot, we'll see. It ultimately, on its initial introduction, it is a pretty good piece of legislation. Maybe that's unfair of me. It's a very good piece of legislation. There are some areas that I'm sure Anthony and I probably agree on where we think it could be better. And from my perspective, I think we're lawmakers, and we're lawmakers that have the advantage of 30 years of experience in integrity commissions across the nation. So we should learn from that. We should learn from international experience, and we have the chance to write a piece of law that's world's best practice. And right now, it's not quite there. We don't have whistleblower protections that we could have. We can talk more about that later. There is some tension around how high the bar is to have a public hearing when in the public interest to do so. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure, this phrase exceptional circumstances. I think that we could do a whole lot better in the Statutory Oversight Committee that'll be set up to keep an eye on this commission. I think we could make sure that didn't give governments too much control over this body, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. And I think we need to be very careful, actually, that this commission has a strong inspector. We can talk about that a bit later, and that it has the kind of budget that it needs to undertake its role. So there's just a few things I would say that that many people are discussing that we could improve on.
Thanks, Helen. Anthony, what were you surprised by the in exceptional circumstances when that appeared in the legislation, the bill? Sorry,
I was startled. But before I address it, can I just say how delighted I am to be here with you two, Helen and Sophie, who are you're my heroes. I really admire so much the work that independents are doing, and I think it's transformed and is transforming Australian government at a federal level. So good on you. All right, coming back to my little disappointment, like Helen, I thought it was a wonderful bill, and I was very pleased that the Attorney General was so consultative. Although I'm sworn to confidence about the contents of our meetings, our organisation had 3 separate meetings with the Attorney General and his task force, and that was so encouraging. So I guess for that reason, it was a bit of a surprise to find that at the last minute there appeared this phrase that I think is rather difficult. So without boring everybody who's listening, I'll just say this. You do have to have public hearings. I know there's a body of opinion that fears public hearings, but the best practice is that in important cases where the public interest demands it, there should be public hearings, because the public need to know about serious corruption. They need to also ensure, by watching what's happening, that the process is fair and reasonable. And there's nothing worse than investigations behind closed doors. They don't satisfy anyone and they don't serve a useful purpose. This sort of legislation requires that there be a presumption in favour of private hearings, and that's a good idea. I don't have any problem with that at all, because having been had a bit of experience myself in the New South Wales ICAC, I can see the value of private hearings, and they're very necessary for the Commission to get an idea of what really is going on. It's all a battle to get to the truth, and if there is corruption, to uncover it, and it's not easy to do. So private hearings are terrific in giving all the information out, but to do so in a way that doesn't disturb anyone's reputation and so on. But once all that's been done, and the Commission then looks at all the material it's gathered together, they may well think it's in the public interest to have a final public hearing, where a lot of that evidence is brought before the public for the reasons that I've given. So that's why you have to have public hearings. And the reason I was troubled by this aspect of the bill was that I think the phrase exceptional circumstances really does pose a hurdle. If you look at the whole of the phrase, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers here will have seen enough in the press and media to know what it is that the Commission can only hold a public hearing if it is in the public interest to do so, and there are exceptional circumstances. Now, the need to look at the public interest is terrific. That's what you really have to do, because it won't always be in the public interest to hold public hearings. There may be unfair damage to reputation that should be avoided. There may be national security reasons. There can be all sorts of reasons why it's better not to have a public hearing. But where it is a really serious matter, and where it's desirable for the public to know about the allegations of corruption and to listen to the unfolding of the evidence, then I think, even though reputations may be damaged, they will not be unfairly damaged, provided natural justice is afforded to people who are present in the hearing. And then I think the Commission can make a decision that there should be a public hearing. But then to put this extra barrier there is really difficult, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. I just want to focus on one argument the Attorney General's put forward. He says, well, there aren't many public hearings in New South Wales. If you look at how many there were in the last year, it's really only a handful where there's a lot of private hearings. And he uses that argument to say, well, that's why we're happy to have exceptional circumstances. But what he overlooks, of course, is that private hearings normally comprise a hearing involving only one witness. So if you have 40 private hearings, you've actually taken evidence from 40 people. If you then decide to hold a public hearing, there's only one, but all of those, or all the relevant ones of those 40 witnesses, then come forward and they're heard publicly in one go. It might take a few weeks, but that's why there's a disparity between the numbers. It doesn't prove that public hearings don't happen, or that they happen only rarely. It really demonstrates that the New South Wales ICAC holds a lot of hearings in private, which is good, and only holds a public hearing when all those private hearings have been finished and assembled. So that's I think, my view about public hearings in this test.
Thanks, Anthony. Yes, there's that concern that inserting those words, holding public hearings, both when it's in the public interest and in exceptional circumstances, will mean that we don't get public hearings. It'll really hold it up. And Helen, I just wanted to have a chat. There's a little bit of a difference between this model and the model that you proposed in the last term, and particularly around your model was the Integrity Commission, and this one is an anti-corruption commission. What would you see as a big difference there, and what were you hoping for in this model?
Well, Sophie, you and I both big believers in preventative health. I apply the same reasoning to this, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And in my model, there was a significant resourcing put to pro-integrity measures into an integrity framework that included integrity plans across public service departments. It had a specialist commissioner for education and research to learn and to get an evidence base around systemic corruption, serious corruption, around prevention, so that we could learn and we could prevent, and we could set ourselves up as a nation and as public officials to be our best selves, and to put forward a body of work that would enable us to do this. I think that unfortunately this bill does not go there. There are some pro-integrity measures in it, but nowhere near to the extent to which I had proposed. I've put that to the Attorney General, of course, and he's pretty clear, and this bill makes it very clear that the intent of this commission is a big one, and that's to stamp out corruption and to find corruption in dark places. So that is a key difference. I think one kind of what seems like a minor thing, and I'm not a lawyer, as many people would know, and even the way I talk makes it very clear that I'm not. But what I've learned from my legal friends is the power of a word. And when it comes to the protections that my bill had around protecting people, their reputation, their safety, their mental and physical health, for example, national security, and so on, in terms of the bar set for a public hearing, my bill used the term the Commissioner must give regard to those issues in determining whether it was appropriate and in the public interest and safe to do a public hearing. This bill actually uses the word may. So I think in some ways my bill was a little stronger around providing safeguards. Many people wouldn't know that. I think perhaps my critics would say Helen just wants to have public hearings. Well, no, I'm very much of the same mind as Anthony. This is correct that the default position is private hearings, absolutely correct. And I believe there should be strong safeguards there before we go to a public hearing. So that's one I think important difference. There are other key differences, of course. I would say that whistleblower protection is a pro-integrity measure as well. And I guess you might have some questions about that later, so I won't speak too much to that now. But there are a couple of key differences, I think. And well, I hope very much that we do find ways to strengthen our public integrity across our various other integrity organisations in the nation. And many people ask me, Helen, when this Integrity Commission is stood up, is your work done? What will you do then? Well, there's plenty more to do. Sophie, I know you know lots of things we've got to do yet.
Oh no, this is just the start, really. This is just the safety net, as we know, and Anthony very much knows. Well, why don't we talk about whistleblower protections, Anthony and Helen? There are some whistleblower protections in this model, but I think that a lot of us feel that they are not going far enough, and we're seeing currently that we've got those two major cases currently in front of the court at the moment. So what would your comments be, Anthony, on the need for whistleblower protections and what the government has promised going forward but doesn't sort of commit to in this bill?
Yes, look, I agree entirely with Helen. It would have been lovely if those protections and ideas that she had for integrity in her bill were carried forward here. I suppose in defence of the Attorney General, he'd made a promise to get this done before Christmas. Maybe that was, one of the reasons why he's taken, as it were, the most straightforward path towards getting the legislation through and just focused on, well, mainly on anti-corruption measures. And he certainly promised, I think quite openly, I don't think I'm revealing anything here, that next year he will introduce whistleblower protections at a high level. So on that issue, I think we most people know that in the private business world, whistleblower protection is much better than it is in the public sphere. And that's because of the shortcomings in a piece of legislation called the Public Interest Disclosure Act. I won't bore everyone with legal jargon, but one of the things I notice looking around Australia is that one of the problems that seems to affect anti-corruption or integrity bodies is that there's always a tension between the whistleblower and those who are alleged to have acted improperly. And in the way that maps out, if there are court proceedings, the whistleblower always comes off second best. And that's because the legislation is really quite poor. It doesn't protect the whistleblower, and it really leaves them in a situation where the defence is available to somebody who's sacked a whistleblower, for example, are really unfairly slanted. They let the employer who's sacked an innocent and honest whistleblower, they protect the employer, and I think they do so unfairly. So that's one instance in which I think we have to get much better, a much greater, really an overhaul completely of the Public Interest Disclosure Act. And I think we've got to recognise that whistleblowers, they're often annoying people, they annoy their fellow employees because, no one likes a dobber, do they? And that's Australian society, and we don't dob on our mates, and and if you've got a whistleblower, they're regarded as whingers and all this sort of thing. But the truth is, in many cases, the whistleblower is an honest person who's seen something that needs to be revealed and needs to be remedied, and they're shunned and pushed aside. And then, of course, there's the other type of whistleblower that you've referred to, Sophie, those who expose classified information that we would think is absolutely in the public interest to be disseminated, and then they're prosecuted for breaching classified information laws. And that's a terrible situation. Bernard Collaery's situation was terrible, and one of the best things that Mark Dreyfus has done is to bring that prosecution to an end. And I only wish that the other major whistleblower cases could also be dealt with in the same way.
Sophie,
Yes.
I might just add to that. And Anthony's so very, very right, of course, about this. And I would also agree that the Attorney General is quite publicly stated that he's very aware that the Public Interest Disclosure Act is no longer completely fit for purpose, and indeed he wrote it. And wrote into that there would be a statutory review of that act, and that review happened in 2016. And none of the recommendations from that review that were undertaken by Moss have in fact ever been implemented. So not only has he publicly said that he will do that, he'll implement those recommendations, but he'll update them, because 2016 is a long time ago now. So he's been very clear that he intends to do that, and I really welcome that. But I guess I would say that the whistleblower protections that are written into the NAC legislation pretty much mirror what's already in the Public Interest Disclosure Act. So as it stands, should the National Anti-Corruption Commission be stood up tomorrow, a whistleblower who came forward would be exposed to all of those problems that Anthony's just articulated. Now, to that end, the attorney has also said publicly that he intends to fix this before the new NAC is operational. So I really welcome that. I'm really grateful that he has said that. But I'd also add that this is an opportunity to have world's best practice, and world's best practice would tell us that we should establish a safe house for whistleblowers, a dedicated whistleblower commissioner or authority. Certainly in my own legislation, I had that written into the Integrity Commission. I'm certainly not wedded to that. It doesn't have to be in it. It'd be nice if it was. It'd be nice if it was all rolled in there together. But I think that this is a real opportunity to set this up. It could be a standalone authority. It could sit within another authority. But I think we only need to look at the Dutch, who have such a thing, and it works very, very well. And it would give our whistleblowers significant protection. And it would also make sure that anyone who breached the Public Interest Disclosure Act and brought difficulties or harm to a whistleblower would subsequently be brought to answer for that. And right now they're not. So I think that's what I would add to that conversation.
Thanks, Helen. We might just one thing that really an issue that really gets up people's noses is pork barrelling or rorting of the system, and you know, of course, that's the misuse of public money to win a favour in an electorate. And it's not something that is, you know, only one party does or another party does, but it was becoming quite bold and blatant and systematic with the previous term. So what a lot of people are asking is, will the National Anti-Corruption Commission actually have a role in, or any scope in, controlling this? It's not actually illegal. So what role will the Anti-Corruption Commission have in sort of controlling that type of behaviour? Oh, Anthony, shall we start with you?
Well, a lot of legal jargon about to come up on this one, I regret to say, but I'll try and avoid the jargon if I can. Look, what is pork barrelling? Well, my colleague Geoffrey Watson, who's never lost for a word, said that it's the misuse of taxpayers' money, and that is one definition of it: the blatant misuse of taxpayers' money for political advantage. However, pork barrelling, as it's sort of colloquially known, is really the example of during election time, would-be politicians make promises to people in their electorate, and that's how pork barrelling was originally contemplated. It can be unattractive, it can be quite persuasive. People who are elected don't have to fulfil those promises. But when it comes to the government itself setting up a scheme to hand out grants of very large amounts of money, then you get a situation where you have to be very careful, because this is where the possibility of the misuse of taxpayers' money comes up. Some people say, well, pork barrelling in that sense is not illegal. Well, I don't agree. I think that the blatant misuse of large sums of money, primarily for political advantage, I think constitutes or can constitute a criminal offence, misconduct in public office. And so ministers who take part in that could be not only investigated, but ultimately prosecuted for a criminal offence. So in that regard, there's a difference here between the legislation that the Attorney General's put forward and the New South Wales ICAC legislation, which does allow the New South Wales Commission to investigate whether there's been a serious breach of ministerial standards. And of course, it's in that area that you might get not only the possibility of a criminal offence of misconduct in public office, but you could get a serious conflict of interest, for example, that breaches the ministerial standards. And in such a case, there could be in New South Wales a finding of corrupt conduct that's not necessarily a criminal offence. But we don't have that in this legislation. And that's, I think, a matter that we've taken up with the Attorney General. He doesn't want breaches of ministerial standards to be part of the anti-corruption weaponry. He says that should be dealt with by Parliament. And okay, well, that's fair enough. But coming back to your central question, I repeat again that pork barrelling, where it is the blatant use of public money, primarily or solely for political advantage, could constitute a criminal offence, and it could be investigated by this commission.
Thanks, Anthony. Helen, would you like to add to that, or we?
No, I think I've got nothing more to add. I think Anthony has described that beautifully. And I think what I know, and I'm sure what you know too, Sophie, is that this really matters to people. It matters to people on the street because they know that if public funds are used for political purposes, not for the public good, it means that things that we need, investment in healthcare, investment in education, investment in fundamental infrastructure is sacrificed for one purpose over another. And we see that and we feel that. I think it's something that really matters to everyday people.
Thanks, Helen. I'm just having a look at the questions. There's from the audience. I'm just going to have a quick look through. Okay, so Tony's asking, is there room for more changes to the bill once it's tabled or it's been introduced, such as stronger whistleblower protection? So we might just address that briefly. Thanks, Tony. Yes, so the bill has been introduced, but it hasn't yet been debated in the House of Reps and it hasn't yet been voted on. So there is an opportunity to debate it further and hope, potentially introduce amendments. Helen, you've had a lot of experience with this type of thing previously.
Yeah, so Tony, really important question. And this is one of the wonderful parts about Parliament, I reckon. When Parliament's working well, we get a piece of legislation, it goes off to a committee and it's in a committee right now. And the public has an opportunity to put in submissions, and many people have. If you go to the Australian Parliament House website and look up the committee process for the National Anti-Corruption Commission Legislation Committee, you will find submissions from all sorts of people with comments and ideas and amendments for this bill. If you have trouble sleeping, you could go onto the website and look at the recordings of today's public hearings and hear what many people have had to say about this bill. So that process, the committee process, will continue, and on the 10th of November, I'm a member of that committee. We are charged with bringing a report to the Parliament around the findings of our committee and any recommendations that may be there for amendments or changes. Then it's up to the Attorney General and the government to determine whether they wish to accept any of those recommendations. And then, as Sophie said, each member of Parliament could go to the Attorney General and have a conversation and say, look, I'd really like to make an amendment to this clause or that clause. And the Attorney might say, terrific idea, let's do that. Or no, thank you. But you can put that to the Parliament and see how you go. And then it comes to the vote, of course, and then all of you would know that's a numbers game. But from there, the bill will head across to the Senate, and there's an opportunity across in the Senate as well to make amendments before it passes or doesn't pass through the upper house. So plenty of room to move, but the government is very determined to get this legislation through by Christmas. So let's see how we go, but it's not over yet, that's for sure.
No, it's not over yet, and it is very positive that they do want to have an integrity body by the end of this year legislated. But Helen, you mentioned the committee that you're a part of. Maybe you could explain a little bit more about, because this is the statutory oversight committee that you were talking about, and one of the issues that was very important to a lot of people was the fact that we would have preferred that the government didn't have control of that body by having a non-government chair, and we're very lucky. Well, it's wonderful that you've been accepted onto that as well as the deputy chair, which is wonderful. But just wondering what your comments are on the statutory body.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. And just again, not everybody's having to spend their days thinking about these things like perhaps some of us are. So just to be clear, I'm on a committee at the moment, which is a select committee, which means it's just stood up for a very short period of time to look at an issue, and we're looking at this legislation, and then that committee will dissolve once we've done our job. The committee that Sophie is referring to is what's in the bill written into the legislation, and that's a statutory oversight committee. So that's a committee that's set up by law in the Parliament once this legislation is passed and becomes an act. And that statutory oversight committee would be a joint committee, so members from the House of Representatives and members from the Senate, and then it would be the job of that committee to do things like sign off, agree on who the commissioner for the Anti-Corruption Commission could be. The Attorney General's Department gets the opportunity to put forward names, and then those names would go to the Statutory Oversight Committee, and it would be the job of that committee to say yay or nay. That's one job of the committee. And I'm outlining this one because it's really important who the commissioners are. We want to make sure that these are not political appointments. We need to make sure that the commissioners who are appointed to this really powerful body have the trust of the full parliament, the trust of the nation. So therein lies, I think, a weakness in this legislation, in that this statutory oversight committee, I should say, as it's drafted, the casting vote, the chair of this committee, as it's drafted, is a government member. Now, I would put for discussion is that we could have, in fact, a non-government chair of that committee. Indeed, we could have co-chairs, or indeed we could write into the legislation that but 2 members of the government and 2 members of the opposition need to agree on who the commissioner should be. I think there's some remedies we need to put in place on this oversight committee to make sure that we have the trust of the parliament. So maybe Anthony might like to comment some more on that.
Yeah, well, the Centre for Public Integrity in its submission today included that point. We think that the idea that the chair is a member of the government has problems with it. We all know that committees of this kind can, they can get a bit abrupt with one another at times, different points of view that maybe stem from their political backgrounds. And so if there's a casting vote, it really is better if it's not a member of the government. At the very least, perhaps it could be rotational. That's another way in which it could be done. All those ideas that Helen's mentioned, we think would be much better than the present way the bill is structured. Again, not only for Parliament to have confidence in it, but for the public to have confidence in it as well.
Thanks, Anthony. Now, there's a question here from Malcolm about lobbying, which is another issue I think it'd be great to touch on. So I'll just read out Malcolm's question. Regulation of lobbying is very weak at the federal level. Does the creation of the National Anti-Corruption Commission need to be complemented by legislation to improve registration, transparency, and political finance activities of lobbyists? Big question. Anthony, would you like to touch on that to start with?
Well, Helen would know more about it than I do. I mean, I go down to Parliament half a dozen or 10 times a year, and I'm always startled by these great bundles of people out in the garden. And I ask, who are they? And I'm told they're all lobbying members of Parliament. It really scares me, I must say. So we obviously need to have a better system, and I'm told that the system isn't too good at the moment. Maybe I could ask Helen to outline it from her perspective.
It came as a big surprise to me too, Anthony, when I saw people. They usually have orange lanyards, actually. Look, lobbying is not illegal, and it's important that that the public and that groups within the public, that business communities, indeed integrity advocates, have the opportunity to come to the Parliament and to meet with members of Parliament, or to meet with ministers, for example, and put their case around a particular issue. I think what I would say is that we don't have enough transparency around this. We don't know who has access to the halls of Parliament, who has access to a minister's office. Now, some remedies to this have been put forward. I think the Australia Institute actually put out some terrific ideas leading up to the last election, I think all of which I agreed with at the time and still do. Ideas such as ministers opening their diaries so that it's transparent who's coming to see them, for example, is one. One thing I was really happy about very recently, and it was on those list of reforms around integrity more broadly and transparency more broadly, was the Prime Minister has banned political fundraising in the public spaces of Parliament House. And I think that's really important too. This issue about who has influence, who can pay large sums of money for a seat at the table comes into the whole political donations realm. But the fact that that could happen in the Parliament of Australia, I found incredibly distasteful. And to be honest, at the last budget prior to the election, I was staggered by the numbers of people I saw here and the places that they had access to. And I had no idea how much they were paying for that access, but I knew it was a fair dime or two. So I think there's a lot of reform that we need in this area that would, again, just make the whole process much more transparent.
Yeah, could I add something to that too, Sophie? I mean, I'm a bit like Helen on that point. You know, each year at budget time, I would spend the next day scouring the newspapers for the photos of barons of business who were dressed up to the nines with ministers also dressed up to the nines. And I just kept thinking, this is wrong. You know, you can't have all this going on. And yet it was absolutely running riot. And there are all sorts of people there, some of them very nice people and some of them not so nice, I thought.
Well, there's a couple of very big issues there. Why don't we explore the issue of campaign finance and political donations, because that's very topical for us at the moment as well. The Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters has invited submissions on donation reform. And a lot of us have been working very hard on that, including the Centre for Public Integrity, and I'm sure Helen as well, and many others. But we've seen over the last couple of elections about the undue influence of big money in our elections, I should say, in the attempt to sway the outcome of an election. And many argue that actually Clive Palmer, when he spent $80 to $100 million, did have an influence on the 2019 election. But we also had things like, which was very helpful, was Climate 200 as a fundraising body as well. So now we're starting to sort of grapple with this idea of political donations. So how do we absolutely take the undue influence of big money and vested interests out of our political decision making? But at the same time, one of the things I've been grappling with is also trying to keep that level playing field so that independents and candidates from minor parties do have a level playing field going forward into the future, because it's quite a complex issue, isn't it? And maybe Anthony, we start with you on that one.
Yeah, well, in general terms, Sophie, I think you've hit the nail on the head. The undue influence of money in politics is a very serious problem for integrity. And, it's obvious that it is. So the remedies we should be talking about, and many of us are talking to the joint committee, which is dealing with these matters. The remedies are these. First of all, donations. We need to bring the threshold for disclosure of donations down to a much lower level than it is at the moment. Secondly, we need to enlarge the definition of donations to capture things like fundraisers, corporate dinners, where people pay $10,000, $15,000 to sit next to a politician. They're not covered as donations under the present definitions. They should be. Then nextly, we need to cap the donations themselves. There'll be a lot of arguments about what that figure should be, but there has to be a cap on it, because if you don't put a cap on it, it explodes. And then again, we need transparency for real-time disclosure of what donations are being made, and other things as well. But that's just an outline of what we need to do in the field of donations. In the field of campaign spending, this is a hard one, and I think it's particularly hard for independents. But as a general rule, there's not the slightest doubt that what we see with Clive Palmer and what we see with the exploding expenditure by the major parties, what we are seeing is an arms race of money. And it's also encouraged by the media to a large extent, because they get a lot of the money at election time. So we've got to put caps on campaign spending, but caps that are fair. Fair because they have to allow for independents also to be supported. We've done a paper on it. It's very complicated, and I wouldn't try and discuss it all tonight, but basically we think that $300,000 per for a party per endorsed candidate would be a fair way of doing it. If you add that all up together, if you were standing in every seat, it's still a lot of money, but it's about half of what is being spent at the moment. We think that the independent candidates should get a bit more than that, and we've set all that out in our paper. As an independent, you might think, well, that's not enough, but we have to bring the figure down overall, and yet we have to be fair to independents who aren't in as favoured a position financially as the big parties. So that's campaign spending. As I say, it's quite complicated, and the paper we put up yesterday was 36 pages long, so I won't try and go through it tonight. The next thing we need to do, of course, is to have truth in political advertising, which I think it goes hand in hand with the expenditure of trying to control the expenditure of money. So, and we need to revise the way in which public funding occurs. Public funding is a good thing, but it's out of control and rampant at the moment, and it doesn't work. It's meant to stop the undue influence of money, but it just sits there alongside it at the moment. So we've got to reframe and revise that, and yet to do it fairly. So it's not an easy subject to get on top of, but I think they're the areas we've got to look at.
Helen, do you have anything to add to Anthony's comments?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything Anthony said. I guess I would add to that real-time disclosure of political donations, I think, is extremely important, and especially during an election campaign where the general public doesn't find out for a very long time after the election who was actually funding parties. The other thing I would say as an independent is we never know as a general public how much money is spent per seat. All of the money that's donated into the major parties goes into a slush fund, and when they report back as a party. They don't report back per seat. So, Sophie, when you put your report into the AEC, the people of Mackellar will know how much money was raised and spent in your campaign, but no one will have any idea how much was spent by the major party candidates. I think the other thing, just to add to this, is I think the Grattan Institute report that came out recently, speaking about the way public money, so the amount of money that's spent by governments for political purposes on advertising rather than for the public good, showed around, I think it was $50 million per year is spent basically pumping up their own tyres, when in fact it should be used for things like public health campaigns and the like. So I think that certainly needs addressing. And I guess I would just say that in my own experience, I have a disclosure amount of over $1,000. I disclose every donor, their name, and I put that up on my website very regularly. I can't remember what I think it's every quarter for a donation above 1,000, and for any donation that's at the AEC level, I put that up. I think it's within a week, actually, or 5 days. I don't get many of those, but it's not hard to do. You know, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's too hard to do. You can never do it," but you can. It's really easy, actually. And what's more, I think, Sophie, you would find this, that people who are really engaged in their democracy and want to really support a community independent are really proud to have their name there. So it's really not a big deal, I don't think, and I think we should do it.
Great, thanks, Helen. We've only got another 10 minutes or so, so I might just go to a couple more of the audience questions. This one's from Meredith. Would Julian Assange benefit from Australia establishing a safe house for whistleblowers?
Oh, that's a great question.
Thanks, Meredith.
I don't know. Anthony, you'll have to jump in here. Given that he's being prosecuted by the United States, I'd like to think he would, but I don't know.
No, I don't think so. I think that, this is an international prosecution. There's not much we can do except a lobby behind the scenes to try and get them to drop the prosecution. I don't think that the type of protection we're hoping for domestic whistleblowers could be applied to Julian Assange, unfortunately. He's not a very popular person. Some people don't like him, but the position he's in is really deplorable, I think.
Tony asks, just talking about campaign spending, the Irish government has a good idea with a set amount for all the candidates.
Yes. Well, I don't know much about the Irish system, but, you know, we've got two major parties here, and maybe three in one sense, but and we've got a lot of independents. So I think that we have to work our own way through it rather than, you know, I think in general terms, we can emulate what happens in other countries, how they work out their caps. But we have to look at it in the context of our own country. And so if you want to go to our website for the Centre for Public Integrity, Tony or anyone else, you'll see there our submission to the government, to the committee yesterday. And it's got a lot of detail in it. And you might have a look at that and see what you think about that. It's all up for discussion. Everybody's got to have an input on this, and we welcome people who don't find our suggestions helpful. But I'm not too sure I could make any useful comment about Ireland. I suspect that a pint of Guinness might be involved there somewhere.
Or two. Thanks, Anthony. Linda's asking, will this commission, the National Anti-Corruption Commission, be able to address abuse of public office by a public servant of a serious misconduct allegation?
If it falls within the definition of corrupt conduct, yes.
Yes, so definitely. And then Ronald has asked, can you give some examples where public hearings might unfairly damage reputations?
Well, I think
that's a tricky one.
I think you can ask the Murdoch Press to give you a few examples there. I'm not too sure there are any really. You know, I've been watching public hearings in New South Wales for a while, and they're often criticised. I think the sort of thing that we really have to make sure doesn't happen, and my good friends in the media won't like me saying this, but often the media descend on a public hearing and they exacerbate the problem by showing photos of a witness next to somebody who's been or thought to be corrupt, by association that suggests to the public who watch the media or read it that person may also be corrupt. I mean, I think they've got to control the media. One way I think it can be done under this legislation, it does give the Commissioner the power to give directions, and the sort of directions that can be given are to inform the public and the media that a particular witness who's giving evidence is not under investigation, is not suspected of any wrongdoing, and is there to assist the investigation to come to a just and proper result. Something like that. I mean, that could be done over and over again. I honestly, to answer your question, I can't think of any example where a public hearing has either deliberately or inadvertently destroyed someone's reputation in an unjust and unfair manner. I cannot. And I know there will be people who argue to the contrary, and I'd love to have that debate with them. But my opinion is that it's a bit of a furphy, really.
Yep. Well, we might finish up with one last question. I have been very lucky to be working with the Centre for Public Integrity about the Ending Jobs for Mates. And would just be interested in both of your opinions on, you know, how detrimental is it that government appointments often become political appointments? So we saw with at the end of at the last term, there were 26 political appointments to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. So why, just maybe in your opinion, why is this such a negative thing for our democracy? And then I can sort of wrap up a little bit and talk about what we would love to see happen with those government appointments, how to make it a more independent process. Anthony?
Well, I think, first of all, you need, for appointments to a body like the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, there should be an independent panel that makes recommendations to the government. The idea of just pulling people out of the office who are your mates and putting them in there is really distasteful. And it's also dangerous to democracy, because the Administrative Appeals Tribunal reviews a lot of the administrative decisions made by the government. And if you've got people there who are just going to favour government decisions, then that's really bad. And even if they don't, the perception is there that they will. So every way you look at it, it's just a really horrific way of appointing people to very important positions. We mustn't we must do something to stop that.
Mm.
100% agree. And I mean, this position should be, people should be appointed according to merit and their skill set, qualifications and so on. And I think it's actually quite fascinating at the moment that there's a bit of debate happening in regard to the issuing of warrants for telecommunications intercepts in the National Anti-Corruption Commission legislation. That a legally qualified member of the AAT can sign off on such a warrant. They can right now, and for other purposes. So to politicise positions such as that, I think, is truly damaging to our democracy. It erodes trust, and that needs to stop. So I really do support an independent tribunal. I think it's fundamental. I think it's something we should get on and do. It needs to stop.
Let's do it. Exactly. It sounds wonderful. Thank you both so much for joining tonight. It really has been a very interesting discussion and very, very detailed as well. So again, thank you for all the work you've both been doing over the years towards greater integrity in our political system. And we'll continue to work. This is a start with the National Anti-Corruption Commissioner, and we will continue to work away and keep going as far as we can. So thank you both for joining, and thank you to the entire audience who joined us tonight. I'd also like to thank Anyo and Rob and Cara who organised the event. It's always great to have a chat and see you all, and hopefully we see you all again soon.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks everyone.
All.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Bye, Sophie.
Bye. Thanks, Anthony, so much.